Member for North Coast.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I stand here today to respond to the 2016 throne speech. I must say that on Tuesday, I sincerely felt sorry for the Lieutenant Governor. I felt sorry for her and that she was required to read aloud such pomposity. It must be painstakingly embarrassing to have to read such phony, fudged, and disingenuous words crafted from the Premier's office. I guess, Honourable Speaker, desperate times call for desperate words by a desperate Premier who has failed on her election promises. In the 2013 throne speech, a new LNG industry was to eliminate our debt, to eliminate the PST, and create 100,000 jobs and $1 trillion in economic activity. In the 2014 throne speech, LNG was, quote, a chance, not a windfall. In the 2015 throne speech, LNG was still a, quote, generational opportunity, but barely mentioned, otherwise in an effort to change the channel. Now, in 2016's throne speech, government admits that their timelines will not be met. Today, government has, quote, done everything they can, but global conditions are posing new challenges. Today, this government says LNG export is merely necessary in order for current workers in the national gas industry to not lose their jobs. I quote from the speech, "We must begin to export or the 13,000 people who depend on this industry today will be out of work." This is a serious concern and a colossal failure of this government who was going to shower us in gold from a lucrative LNG industry. The speech also says government will establish the Prosperity Fund, aka the magic fund from the 2013 election that was going to pay for everything and eliminate the debt and eliminate the PST. We know this is never going to happen, especially if we are to develop an LNG industry simply to maintain the current natural gas jobs we have now. There's no new prosperity in that. The theme of this year's throne speech is around the Premier's new slogan about being courageous yes people. I quote from the speech, "Steadfast, resilient, and courage to get to yes." That's the spirit of who we are as British Columbians. The throne speech also says our great spirit is demonstrated with the Great Bear Rainforest Agreement, one of the greatest acts of conservation in our country, one that establishes the certainty required for economic development, an agreement that enshrines human well-being and an opportunity for First Nations to benefit. Well, Honourable Speaker, these words are mocking, considering a week after this announcement, the Premier insulted and disrespected the very same First Nations of the Great Bear Rainforest. She called these people the forces of no and a ragtag group of people for having dissenting views on a project near the most important salmon-bearing river within the Great Bear Rainforest. Now, Honourable Speaker, the Premier and the proponent are determined to build here. The forces of no are simply asking for the location to be moved off this site to one of the many alternative sites nearby. At what was called the Salmon Nation Summit held in Prince Rupert, the Lilu Island Declaration was signed by hereditary leaders from the Skeena watershed to the Tsimshian territory on the coast. All of these Indigenous peoples, known as the title and rights holder in this region, recognized and reaffirmed the need to safeguard Lilu Island and the Skeena estuary. Flora and Agnew banks are essential to juvenile salmon. First Nations and non-First Nations communities throughout the watershed and across the coast depend on this salmon. After learning more about the science and the risks to the estuary, this declaration was signed by hereditary chiefs of Lac Wallams and supported by the likes of Grand Chief Stuart Phillip. This was not a so-called ragtag group of people. These are our informed Indigenous peoples and Northerners who know the science and know the facts, and they understand the risks of industrial development to this region of our province. This was a powerful statement of people coming together to defend the Northern way of life. To try to discredit these leaders by calling them ragtag is untrue and simply and totally disrespectful. The path to reconciliation and advancement of LNG projects, or any projects, does not start by labeling a group of hereditary chiefs, of matriarchs, leaders, and citizens with legitimate concerns as ragtag. You advance projects by bringing people together and finding compromises, such as the Great Bear Rainforest Agreement the Premier speaks so highly of in the throne speech. We all want responsible resource development and shared benefits. The Premier, however, prefers name-calling. It's reminiscent of a Harper-era strategy of divide and conquer, us and them. Remember foreign-funded radicals? I've come to learn that this way of dialogue in these chambers seems to be the way we go. But to speak this way to the citizens we represent, the Premier not only insults the very citizens she represents, but insults our neighboring province, saying Alberta has lost its way. This is in the same breath stating that she hopes the trade partner she ridicules will buy our hydroelectric power. The Premier recently said in regards to the 300+ people gathered at the Salmon Summit in Prince Rupert, quote, "The world is being divided in two. The people that will say no to everything and the people who want to find a way to get to yes." I'm not sure what the science the forces of no bring up there, except that it's not really about the science. It's not really about the fish. It's about just trying to say no. It's about fear of change. It's about fear of the future. Now, Honourable Speaker, Ian Gill writes in the Tyee an excellent editorial that does a phenomenal job of depicting the true Skeena narrative. It's called "Scolding BC's Forces of No, Our Premier Crassly Divides Us," and I highly recommend the members of this House read it. Honourable Speaker, allow me to quote some passages that describe these matters well. I quote, "Yes, the world is being divided in two, but it is the Premier and her industry pals who are doing the dividing because their powers of persuasion are proving unequal to the task. Her intemperate comments were quickly seized upon by the media thanks to the nicely simplistic, black and white, us versus them, good against evil nature of the battle she sees herself as waging and heroically not resigning from. It is a shockingly unsophisticated view of the world and a deeply divisive one. But when citizens dare to assemble in the public square, citizens who are squarely in the firing zone of the Premier's industrial carpet bombing of the North, well, the Premier just lumps and splits and disdains the diverse opinions of those who happen to not agree with her. She starkly demonstrates a failure not just of political leadership, but also of moral leadership. Suddenly, and we've seen this before, Stephen Harper anyone? She exposes herself as not our Premier at all, but as the Chief Information Officer for a powerful few. She no longer pretends to govern for all British Columbians, just those who agree with her or at least swallow her spin. What a grave strategic error. What a spectacular communications failure. What a fool. Our Premier in Vancouver refers to people up there. She distances them, not just philosophically, but geographically. They're up there. By extension, their views are out there. It's not really about the science, our Premier says, even though the Salmon Nation Summit presented strong, peer-reviewed science that raises serious concerns about the Petronas project and its threat to wild salmon. It's not really about our fish, the Premier says, and yet, actually, it is all about the fish. It's about fear of change. It's about fear of the future, which in truth is absolutely true. People up there do fear for their futures, which is why they devote themselves to participating and, in many instances, expressing dissenting opinions through processes that time and time again favor developers. The fish will be supported, our Premier says. Really? How? Will they be taken into foster care to feed the disproportionate number of First Nations kids currently supported by the Premier's Family First government? The Premier ignores the learnings from the Great Bear Rainforest model she has been schooled to extol, choosing instead to divide people along party lines while she wields the hammer in a fire sale auction of the Skena's cultures, communities, and ecologies in exchange for a dirty, 24-hour-a-day, glaring, clanging, razor-wired encircled, guard dog patrolled, and dangerously combustible industry run by bloodless offshore owners who have no relationship to the lands and who bring nothing but money to the shores. The Skena is rich with ingredients for a narrative that is far more powerful than anything distant corporate and political spin doctors can devise. Forget the Premier's 5 conditions. The people of the Skena have their own conditions, and that's what they are standing up for. That's what they are saying yes to. Our Premier should ask herself, what did they mean by reconciliation? Who has authority on their lands? Who grants permission to even propose a development on their lands, let alone build one? The world is hungry for the Skena's genius narrative, just as it developed a huge appetite for that recently went down in the Great Bear Rainforest. A few years ago, there was no Great Bear Rainforest, only a central mid-coast timber supply area. In the Skena, the battle for 21st century well-being is likewise a battle for narrative made potent by the moral authority of principled resistance. The Skena is a truly great river that deserves its place in the pantheon of BC's great places. It rises as a trickle in our sacred headwaters, and along its course gives life and expression to peoples for whom every inch of the river is sacred. That's what people up there are trying to convey, a narrative in which the Skena ends as it begins, flowing freely in the sacred tidewaters of Salmon Nation. Now, the throne speech states, for over 100 years, British Columbians have successfully created strong, vibrant industries, particularly in the resource sector. But we have too often failed to ensure First Nations receive their fair share of the benefits of a modern economy. We are now moving in the right direction. Moving in the right direction, Honourable Speaker? Honourable Speaker, how is that possible? As Ian Gill points out, the Skena narrative is complex, strong, and diverse, and yet the Premier insults us to a most simplistic narrative of yes or no. Is that moving in the right direction in the 21st century? Near Bella Bella in Heiltsuk territory, at the Namu village site, sits an environmental mess from a once vibrant resource industry, that vibrant resource industry mentioned in the throne speech, and that is salmon canning. The Heiltsuk First Nation have received their fair share, all right, their fair share of a contaminated and abandoned site no one will take responsibility for. Resources and wealth exploited, contamination and mess left for the Heiltsuk people to attend to. Let's talk about the recent BC Supreme Court decision that ruled that this government has breached the honor of the Crown by failing to consult with the Gitga'at First Nation and other coastal First Nations on the Enbridge Northern Gateway Pipeline and Supertanker project. The Premier gave over our rights to a federal review process for the most controversial proposal of our time. That was reckless and disrespectful, not only to First Nations, but all British Columbians, to abandon her responsibilities. The decision reaffirms what the courts continue to say, and that is governments have a legal duty to consult and accommodate First Nations whose rights are impacted by resource projects. We are in a new era when it comes to consulting and truly respecting First Nations. Our new Prime Minister seems to be getting it, but our Premier doesn't care. The throne speech speaks about the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and safe transportation options along Highway 16. But for years, the BC Liberals neglected the families of the murdered and missing women and failed to bring safe, accessible transportation to Highway 16. It took this government getting caught, deleting their own emails about murdered and missing Aboriginal women along the Highway of Tears for these families, and yet so much still needs to be addressed. The throne speech speaks of BC's precious coasts that have long been known for their abundant and sustainable seafood. Yet this government has remained silent after Canfisco has announced it's closing the salmon canning lines in Prince Rupert, the last remaining major cannery on our coast. This government has done nothing to protect up to 600 British Columbian jobs. It allows profit over people. Our precious resource to be shipped overseas, to be processed with cheap and unregulated labor, only to be sold back to British Columbians at a premium. Honourable Speaker, life is really getting unaffordable for British Columbians, and this government prides itself in a job well done. MSP and ICBC premiums continue to skyrocket. The cost of living continues to rise with little support for working families from this government. The people who time and time again come into my office struggling to pay their rent or find an affordable place to live, or who have to choose between eating and paying the hydro bill is growing. This throne speech does little to offer them a hand up, and that I feel is a colossal failure. Lastly, I must conclude by going back to the blatant contempt displayed by the Premier for the very people she purports to represent. It is repressive and deplorable for a Premier who so desperately wants an LNG industry in BC. It is a major step backward in building the necessary relationships for development of this industry or any industry. I sincerely urge the Premier of this province to apologize to the chiefs, to the matriarchs, to the leaders and the people of the Northwest and the Skeena watershed for her callous and shallow remarks. These people are not ragtag or the forces of no. They are legitimate people with legitimate concerns deserving of respect. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.
Thank you, Member.